Welcome to this month's edition of Pulp Nonfiction, the paper and packaging podcast. I'm Greg Johnson with Sustana Fiber, and as always, I'm happy to be joined by my co-host, Dr. Marta Pazos. So, Marta, it looks like we'll be going to science class today, thanks to our guest, Dr. Bill Peck, an advisory board member of the Clean O2 Carbon Capture Technologies. An expert in fluid mechanics with both Ph.D. and master's degrees in mechanical engineering from the University of Alberta, Bill has successfully served as a project scientist at organizations including NASA, Agilent Technologies, and Connor Pacific Environmental.
He is an incredible wealth of knowledge, and one of the people that I was drawn towards almost instantly when I joined the Regeneration.VC board. He is grounded, he is a phenomenal scientist, and he has such a passion for anything that has to do with the environment.
Bill, it's great to see you. We're grateful for your time today, and thank you for visiting with us.
Thank you very much, Greg. It's great to be here on the Pulp Nonfiction podcast. Great to be with you and Marta and having a chance to talk today.
What made it for you? What made you be a scientist? What made you be a scientist with credential?
Well, it's a long story. I mean, how far should I go back?
You can go as far as you want.
I've less than a stellar high school experience, you might say. And actually, I worked in construction and just odd jobs for many, many years. I turned 25, or was turning 25, and I decided that, it's time to think about what to do in the future, right? And so I went back to school. And luckily at the time, the unemployment insurance people had this thing where you could get retraining. So I thought, well, it'd be good to get in my high school. And that was a bit too hard. So I went back to middle school, actually, on my 25th birthday. And I went back to school, and that went pretty good. I got sort of high school equivalency and then went into engineering. And I thought, well, I could maybe try that, right, and see how that goes. And it went well. And it was actually fueled by my interest in motorcycles at the time. Because, I was always interested in racing and motorcycle racing and stuff. And I'm reading all this stuff, and I could never really, I understand a lot of it, but I couldn't really get to the heart of the matter, right? And you can see this motorcycle passion that's kept with me for ever since then.
Right. I absolutely love that, because a lot of people don't realize that science is very much like that for a lot of us, right? Like it is that desire to be able to explain those things that that you need a strong foundation for. And it's also a great, fascinating and inspiring example of, you don't have to start at 18 to make it into a successful scientist. Like you can, you start a little later in life.
I wanted to ask you this from both a personal as well as a professional standpoint. From a sustainability perspective, what do you do in your everyday life? Can you give us some examples of some things you do to help the environment?
Well, I sequester old motorcycles so they're not on the road. So, one of the big reasons I got involved with Regenerate is my mother was a passionate conservationist, I guess, and outdoors person. And she was like, we grew up in oil country, and she was fighting the good fight in oil country in the 60s. You can imagine what a lonely experience that was, right? And so that stayed with me all my life. So it's sort of natural for me, just sort of every part of every day is kind of a day of thinking of, making sure that, we live in sort of a more symbiotic way with the environment.
Do you think that having those big impactful names is helping us with the movement of the fund, which is raising more money, creating more investments, more worth investments?
Yeah, well, certainly the names certainly help. It shows that, people like that are paying attention to what we're up to. The other thing is about Wesley Clark. He's a really smart guy. I mean, you get on these calls with him, and he has so much experience, and he's just I think he's valedictorian at West Point or something like that. I mean, you just look at his history. I mean, it's amazing accomplishment. And so just his raw intellectual horsepower is fantastic just to listen to. When he and Tom talk, you learn so much. He's just a humbling guy, but it certainly does help have. It helps immeasurably to have him, someone who actually working with the Defense Department in a couple areas with DARPA and stuff. You realize how much depth there is and how much intellectual horsepower they have. Not just on weapons, but all sorts of things. I mean, they look at national defense in a much broader spectrum. Right? There's a much larger aperture on national defense. It's everything from food security to population migration and keeping things secure. So having somebody like Wesley Clark, he brings all those dimensions to the table, and lets us think. Helps us think about things in a much broader perspective. Like I think we're talking about, there's sort of a lot of things that people do that sort of are nice, and it's good and well intentioned, but can it have the impact that we really need to have to really do something on the climate? And Wes Clark, for example, gives you a pretty good reality check when you start talking about things like that. So it's a fantastic resource to have him on board.
That incredible depth and breadth, right, of knowledge and experience. I myself find it's fascinating because of the work I do for the Department of Defense, right? And I absolutely love to have that sounding board of like, well, this is what I need to do. I've picked up a few cues here and there to then apply to do a better job for the Department of Defense. So I'm actually personally very, very happy. Unfortunately, we don't get to see Leonardo DiCaprio, but we get to see a couple of his delegates from time to time.
Bill, I know you're aware that Sustana Fiber produces recycled fiber that's used for a lot of sustainable food and beverage packaging. And obviously, a lot of brands are starting to embrace fiber-based packaging more and more rather than plastics, especially in terms of single-use applications. Do you see this promising paper trend continuing from a scientific standpoint?
Oh, I hope so. No, I really do. I really do. I think about it every day when we have to sort through our recycling and different plastics and different this and that. I mean, it has to be recycling. Right now maybe isn't an optimum solution, but it has to be made easier. That's so this whole cradle to cradle thing. And I think this fiber-based stuff maybe plays a key role in that, where we can have more commonality and more an easier way to recycle them, right? An easier and let's say less destructive, a more cost-effective way to recycle materials.
Sure. No, exactly. Marta and I we've had so many conversations about this, and I guess I feel like sometimes people get the impression that there are some people who really are concerned about the environment who are anti-plastic, and we certainly aren't, because we realize that we live in a society where we have to have plastic in some way, shape, or form. Right. Yeah. As you've always pointed out, Marta, I don't think we have to be diametrically opposed, but certainly in terms of single use, it's kind of frightening how much plastic in this country is landfilled.
Certainly, yeah. It just seems so logical to go this path. I mean, thermoplastics. I mean, fantastic. I mean, you think of all the things it's enabled, from medical devices. It's just amazing, right? But just to use it for wrapping food or whatever, or for a drinking straw, it just seems such a waste of such a valuable product, right? And
we have managed to make it so cheap, right? Like we created a material that is pretty much indestructible, and then we use it for something that we only can use one time. So guess what? You're going to have indestructible trash. Cleano 2 is a very interesting example of a very clever man, right, who was working in plumbing for his entire life and thought of, well, let's just put my good plumbing engineering to a really good use, which is I am going to capture CO2 emissions and make them into chemicals that can be used in so many different industries, right? Not that there is anything wrong with soap and food additives, but there is so many more applications that will drive the volume, right? That technologies like this really need to of course, get to the presence. What did you think about it from the get-go? Because I believe that you were more involved at the beginning. I was brought in when I needed to check on the soap, the soap formulations, but you were involved from the beginning. Tell me your experience with it.
Well, yeah, I mean, the first was shock and surprise that they were going to invest in a company in Calgary, because I was born and raised in a little town 90 miles north of Calgary, right? It seemed rather a suspicious coincidence. And and that there was a company that was capturing CO2, which is basically like Calgary is kind of like Houston North, right? It's like oil country, right? And so my first thought was, well, that is encouraging, because I couldn't imagine a company like that being spawned in Calgary when I was growing up, right? Like it was just purely, oil drilling and oil services and all that kind of thing, pipelines, gas pipelines. So that was great. And then I got in touch with Jason, and I was just amazed that this guy had just, had that much motivation and that much passion to develop this product, right? So he saw this problem, and he kind of had this solution, and he kind of just bootstrapped it, just classic Silicon Valley style, in his garage, right? He just came up with this device with a couple of friends, and he's never done a startup. He's never done, I don't think he's ever raised money before or anything like that. And he just got some government grants and this and that, and, his own cash, and sort of made a few gizmos, and it kind of worked, right? And it's actually a very compelling product. And what was so cool was that you had this guy with this idea, and he got in touch with, he hooked up with Dan and Michael at Regenerate, who are so good at branding and marketing. And it was just the right mix, right? To have this guy who was more of a technical guy, and then you get the branding and marketing people working with him to help him along. And suddenly he's the dog that caught the bus, right? And I think that was where I kind of came in, was, okay, it's working now, Jason. How do we take it? How do we open the aperture on your vision and make it, affect a lot of people's lives, right?
That's an amazing story. For someone who was a plumber,
Yeah.
and then capturing carbon and turning it into things like soap. I mean, it sounds like a Ben Franklin story of sorts.
Yeah, it's just the best parts of entrepreneurship, right? And it's fantastic to see him have such success. So, right now what he's facing, of course, is the technical issues of, how do you start making thousands of these things, right? Like they've been making them in their shop in East Calgary right now, and like, how do you start making a whole bunch of these and all the different, you want to fill them to Europe or
scaling up. Right. Well, and talking about scaling up, my next question for you, Bill, I know you used to work at NASA, and what's your take on all these private space companies that are scaling up, like SpaceX and Blue Origin? They're talking about building space hotels, doing intergalactic mining. From an environmental standpoint, particularly looking at this through the science lens, is this long-term going to be okay for our environment? Is it potentially dangerous? I know there's lots of stuff floating around in space, like old satellites and rocket parts.
Doc?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now,
Space
but
waste.
most of it burns up pretty quickly, the smaller stuff, right? But one thing that is relevant is when I was there, I remember going to the cafeteria one day, and it was safety week. And it was sort of like, you remember the old show MASH?
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Used to have the radar would come on over the intercom, right? It was like the government cafeteria, and sort of this intercom came on, and they said, today for Safety Week, we're going to be giving an award for the best chili. And we have a special guest giving the safety award. It'll be Jim Lovell from the Apollo 13 mission.
Oh my gosh.
Whoa.
So I went outside, and there's 150, 200 metal chairs, set up. And I sat there about 10 feet away from Jim Lovell as he gave a talk on his experience on Apollo 13 and Apollo 8.
That's amazing.
And I do remember Apollo 8, Christmas Eve in 1968. And if you probably, you might remember just what a terrible year, or a dramatic year 1968 was, and then the 3 astronauts went around the moon. I'm not a religious man myself, but I remember them reading from Genesis, and just them looking back at the Earth, and then the power of seeing Earth rise over the moon, right, and how that really just spawned the environmental movement. So I guess it's a long-winded way of saying it's amazing for people to go into space, I think, and look back at what the precious part we have of the universe, and for that alone, I think it's incredibly valuable. Now, there's all this other added value that you get from cheap access to space, where you can put in monitoring systems and satellites and stuff like that, and a lot of the work we need to do on the climate is based on satellites going around the Earth, right? We need probably more of these satellites to give us better and better measurements all the time of what's going on. Now, as far as the stuff about space tourism and stuff like that, well, I think I don't know the numbers on it, but obviously it needs to be sort of closely watched, because I know it takes a hell of a lot of propellant to launch somebody into space, and is it really worth it? But certainly that Apollo 8 mission was worth it, because it really did change so much. And I think anything we can do to get people to look back on where we are and have a more sensitive look at what a treasure we have floating in space is well worth it. So there's just a practical cheap access to space where you can get communications and monitoring set up cheaply, and then sort of the emotional part, and then just sort of the idea of having a look at getting people more sensitive to what we really have.
And Bill, just a follow-up question is, when you talk about rocket propulsion, when the rockets take off, all the thrust and everything, from a pollution standpoint, is that a big deal? Is a lot of this dissipated in the atmosphere?
Well, it all gets dispersed in the atmosphere, of course, all the propellants and stuff.
Sure.
But there's quite a bit. I think we should really think carefully about sending too many people up there. But at the same time, you see what they did with the James Webb Telescope. We're looking to the edges of the universe now, right? It's just, we wouldn't want to curtail stuff like that for space tourism, right?
Yeah.
I think we might have to sit down and really budget our what we do to send into space.
I can tell you that generally the propellants used have not been studied to the extent of something like a CO2 or methane, right? So it's kind of like a cop out, right? What we don't know, we don't see, we just don't count, and that is kind of like what's happening right now. However, though, there is always, and this is something that I always keep thinking about, which is the amount of propellant that is going to come out of one rocket that is launched very seldom, right, is never going to be as much as our regular emissions just from burning fossil fuel, right? So that is like the one thing that we always have to keep in mind, right? Like we are always so surprised when we hear, well, this mission to Mars costs millions and millions of dollars, but we may spend more money on clothing in the U.S. alone.
True.
It's like,
yeah, it's a matter of scale, isn't it? Yep. Right? I mean,
exactly. So you always have to, consider what is the benefit versus the damage that you're causing, right? And certainly, yes, propelling a rocket to the outer space is polluting, but it's never going to be as polluting as 1 month of manufacturing in a certain region in China. I can tell you that.
That's a good point, Marta.
Oh, no comparison. Yeah, no comparison.
And just to put an example, I'm thinking of China because that's where most of the manufacturing is. I'm not picking on China, by the way.
Yeah. Well, talking about absolutes, we all know, unless we've lived in a cave, that food and fuel prices have been on a escalating inflationary rate. And we've also seen, though, in a positive sense, though, that both the fuel and food sectors, though, have been leading the way in a lot of positive sustainability actions, including regenerative agriculture and exploring solar and wind power as electric alternatives. But Bill, I wanted to ask you, in terms of sustainability, with these inflationary times that we're in now, do you see that some of these positives developments that we've had over the last couple of years diminishing, where people say, hey, I'm just trying to put food on the table. Carbon capture is great, but I'm paying $6 a gallon for gas. I don't really care about biofuel now. What are your thoughts on when people say or think things like that?
Well, there's short term and long term, right? So, I mean, short term, I think the fuel situation will resolve itself pretty soon. I think a lot of the prices priced into the refining part of it, and not so much the raw. So it's just, what I've learned from the oil business was that anytime there's a disruption, things just go nuts, and a lot of fingers get pointed. But it's just a matter of who's got capacity, and then you don't have capacity refining, and so this thing in Ukraine going on and whatever, it's causing a disruption in the supply chains, and I think they'll sort it out, and the prices will come down again. But I'm hoping that it accelerates our acceptance of alternative fuel supply, right? Like renewables, like solar and wind power, and biofuels. I'm not sure that's going to make a big difference, but certainly the renewables. Hopefully, that what we're seeing now is the instability of our supply chain will accelerate us into getting a more stable, accelerate us towards getting a more stable energy supply. So, I'm hoping that we get a more serious engagement with nuclear in the near future, right? I think that could take up a huge part of the deficit in energy right now.
Talking about nuclear, Bill, we're all pretty familiar, those of us of a certain age, about 3 Mile Island, and certainly younger people with Chernobyl. From a science, just strictly from a science standpoint now, when you talk about nuclear, is it safer now than it was back in the 3 Mile Island days?
Actually, that's a good question for Wes Clark. He's actually a nuclear engineer, I think, or he did nuclear. But I believe it is much different now. I'm not a nuclear engineer. There's my humility coming through. But from what I understand, they've had 50 years or 40 years of development on nuclear power, and so I think we've learned a lot from Fukushima and whatever on how to do it more safely.
Yeah. And maybe to not locate it next to a possibility of being hit by a tsunami,
Well, there's that.
There is that too.
Location.
Yeah, I think that the Japanese truly realized about that as well. And I mean, Chernobyl, I think that was an example of obsolescence, right? Like they were not as modernized and safe as they could have been.
Well, yeah. I mean, 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, they're both built in the 60s, right? Early 60s, I think.
So
Yeah.
older generation plants that
Yeah.
little bit
Like
antiquated. First gen.
I think they're first gen, yeah, both of them.
Yeah, I think that it's very interesting that everybody I speak to about energy is a proponent of nuclear. Why aren't we there? Is still the question, right?
Yeah, there's something. It's almost like there's a stigma to it. I remember my parents. My mom was really for it, and then my dad was like, "No, it's too dangerous," But I think we have to look at all alternatives if we want to.
What's more dangerous than carbon right now, or greenhouse gases?
Right.
I mean, look at the damage that's causing every year, right?
Yeah,
particulates
but we humans, we never look long term, right? And what you're saying, I remember we had a guest that she said that sustainability should be cost efficient, which is true. When you actually do things at the beginning, we know that the economy of scale is not there yet, but in the long run, I mean, I think anybody would agree that if we get the system down to get materials out of agricultural waste, to put an example, it's going to be less costly than digging to get oil out of the ground. I mean, it has to be, especially that particular process, which is nasty, incredibly energy consuming, and we have become incredibly dependent on it. So now that the economy of scale for fuel refinery is there, it seems that we don't know how to apply that to another resource.
Bill, as we wrap up our discussion today, it's been a real pleasure just hearing your perspective on a number of environmental issues. And I wanted to just quickly ask you this. I read a book a long time ago, a marketing book, and it talked about the fact that people buy on emotion and justify their purchases with reason. And I remember that phrase. It just kind of stuck in my brain because it seems to encapsulate the science of sustainability as well as the emotion of people really caring for the environment. And I'm hopeful that type of mindset continues. Do you see that despite the day-to-day struggles that we all have, whether it's with our jobs or the economy or world events? Do you feel that that mindset will continue and people will be optimistic about trying to help the environment through science?
Well, I hope so. Yeah, I definitely do. And and I just go back when you're saying that. I was just thinking again of Jim Lovell, his talk. Right, he was to me that sort of set my whole life in a certain direction. Right, when I look back on it, and that was just hearing him on New Year's Eve or Christmas Eve that time. And then hearing him later talk about his experience, and he said he could put his thumb up and cover the whole Earth with his thumb, right, from the space capsule. And it was sort of the overwhelming beauty of what he was seeing, and also I think he was thinking about for me, he felt like he was expressing the possibility of what we have, right? If people can get excited about the gift they've been given. I think a lot of stuff will just move out of the way pretty quickly. And when I see it now with Regenerate, all the possibilities coming along, and certainly we have a very select group of investments we're looking at that are directed this way, but it's really, really exciting and really gives me just no ends of optimism to see what's possible in the future of all these smart people working on this. I think if we can just build that excitement, I think a lot of the STEM problems will solve themselves. I think people will get excited about, a very diverse set of people will get excited about what they can contribute to creating a more sustainable environment.
Yeah, it all starts with excitement, ease, right?
Yes.
That's also very important.
It really is, and that's one of the things that attract me about Dan and Michael with Regenerate is that they brought the marketing part to the problem. And it's so important, right, to get to articulate your message and your mission clearly in an accessible way.
Bill, you have articulated lots of science stuff for us today, and I know our audience appreciates it. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real treat.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Bill.
Well, it's been a great pleasure talking to you guys on Pulp Nonfiction podcast.